So if we're talking about nationalism and identity as a source of conflict, probably need to deal with this idea of primordialism, which is a theory about why we see ethnic conflict that social scientists have largely dismissed and savaged, but continues to persist in the popular imagination. So I think it's a useful place to start this conversation, but recognizing from the get-go that we're talking about it as a foil. Right? This is an idea that people have. We're thinking about why it's maybe flawed, and then that can maybe help us to understand better ways of thinking about theories about why we see ethnic groups turning against each other when they do. And so to start this off, I'll give you a brief summary of primordialism and then a little discussion about how it entered sort of the public imagination. So primordialism is this idea that ethnic identity is deeply rooted in a person's being, to the point where it's not just sort of saying, oh, this is very important. It's saying that ethnic identity is possibly genetic. And if it is cultural, if we're going to allow for some sort of cultural component, it's a very strict form of culture that was forged in sort of the crucible of time, before history began, in which groups sort of emerged and sort of carried forth this essence of the group into the future. And the reason why primordialism sort of holds this kind of, I call it essentialist, but that's kind of an academic term for it. But the reason why they hold this this view of culture and of identity and of ethnicity is because there's almost sort of an evolutionary component to how they understand the emergence of identity, and that is that identity of ethnic groups emerged in a process of conflict with other groups, and that as part of that conflict, a hatred of other groups became intertwined with how the group exists in the world. And so two groups have a long history. That long history involves conflict. It's woven through a process of natural selection into the understanding of the group's members that other group is the enemy, the other group is bad, the other group is to be fought and resisted. I'm just passing along what the theory sort of implies, and it came into sort of popular awareness in the 1990s when there was this breakup of the Soviet Union and of the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe, and we saw ethnic violence ripping a number of countries apart, particularly Yugoslavia, which was very disconcerting, and created this puzzle for people, which is, why is this happening? Why are neighbors turning against neighbors? Why is ethnic cleansing being carried out where Serbs are driving out Croats and driving out Bosnian Muslims? Why are Croats engaging in counter attacks against Serb populations? What is behind this? And into this sort of sense of this conflict came out of nowhere and we weren't necessarily expecting it, enters Robert Kaplan, who has a book called Balkan Ghosts, and he offers an explanation. It's Ancient Hatreds, in which he essentially says that there are these deep, possibly genetic animosities that exist within these groups, and all it takes is just an opportunity for groups to turn on each other and kill each other, because that's what they are. They are genetically predisposed toward hatred and violence toward each other. And this is something that again, caught on. And Bill Clinton even referenced this idea of ancient hatreds in trying to make a case why the United States ought not get involved in essentially a slow-rolling genocide in the former Yugoslavia, because there's nothing that could be done. That this is a problem that predates time itself and goes back as far as you could possibly trace humanity to groups that have these ancient hatreds. Frequently, I have found when I'm talking sort of casually with people about conflict and anything related to ethnic conflict pops up, it's oftentimes an ancient hatred argument that sort of rises to the surface first, that, well, they've just always been fighting. And first of all, that's not necessarily true, as we'll talk about. Ethnic conflict comes and goes, and even in the case of Yugoslavia, and I'll point to Bosnia in particular, before the war broke out, 1/3 of marriages crossed ethnic lines. Serbs were marrying Croats, Croats were marrying Bosnian Muslims were marrying Serbs. These were not people who, at their very core, at the very deepest part of their being, hated each other. These were people who had been living together side by side and building lives side by side for some time. So there's reasons to be skeptical about the ancient hatreds idea, and academics in particularly have really dug into this and said this is not a solid framework for thinking about the world. And I'll just sort of quote a book review of Balkan Ghosts by Henry Cooper, because I really, this is savage. Perhaps the worst thing that can happen to a journalist is to wind up in the wrong place in the wrong time. Such apparently was the case with Robert D. Kaplan, who happened to be in the Balkans in the late 1980s, just before anything really exciting was happening. Undaunted by this, and unintimidated by his ignorance of the local languages and history, he cobbled together Balkan Ghosts, a dreadful mix of unfounded generalizations, misinformation, outdated sources, personal prejudices, and bad writing. Ouch. Even the off-the-line Balkans deserve better. Balkan Ghosts is deceptive, for it portrays itself as a lively account of the contemporary Balkans based on history and first-hand experience. In fact, it is a distasteful mix of tired cliches, undigested or incorrect historical fact, and personal bias. Let the reader beware. All I can say is I hope nobody ever writes a review of anything I produce that is that scathing. But above and beyond just sort of maybe the ad hominem attacks about whether or not Robert Kaplan is doing a good job making his case, it's worth talking about why social scientists don't buy this idea of ancient hatreds. And the reason is that from a social science perspective, variables have to vary. And what I mean by that is that if we're going to see ethnic violence at one point in time, we have to be able to point to something that caused that's now present that wasn't present before when we didn't see ethnic violence. And primordialism as a theory is really good at explaining why people fight. Right? When people are fighting, we can say ancient hatreds, and that just sort of seems to answer things very in a neat and tidy way. But when you ask, well, why did it happen now? Why was it that groups could live hundreds of years side by side without this kind of violence? How could marriages cross ethnic lines? Ancient hatreds suddenly comes up short. It doesn't have a way of saying, well, the ancient hatreds weren't there last year, but never mind, this is all genetically sort of woven into people. And so, again, primordialism struggles to explain those periods of peace because it's proposing a explanation that is always there, right? And it can't explain what was the trigger. And if you can't explain change, you really can't explain anything with your theory. And so social scientists tend to roll their eyes at this idea of ancient hatreds and say, even if we took as given your understanding of ethnic identity as some sort of biological or quasi-biological thing, if we're going to use it as an explanation, we have to be able to explain periods of peace and periods of conflict. Anthropologists, however, are very hesitant to even give ancient hatreds the benefit of the doubt in terms of how it's working with culture and working with identity. Anthropologists are quick to note that culture is fluid. Right? It's moving, it's changing, it's dynamic. Nothing is static from generation to generation. Cultures are remaking themselves and reorganizing themselves. And so there's no way to talk about an ancient culture, an ancient identity that persists into the present, because we are constantly merging and reimagining and reshaping those cultural structures. We also shouldn't be assuming that cultures are bounded, right? So part of the idea of primordialism is that there are Serbs and there are Croats, and there's no intermingling, transfer of ideas, shared cultural practices, that they are distinct and separate, when in reality, groups blur together, traditions blur together, things get intermingled and mushy, and that's just the reality of human beings. And then finally, anthropologists would note that this really doesn't even square with what we know about sort of the development of identity. And this is where Benedict Anderson's discussion about imagined communities comes in, that one of the things that mass culture was able to make happen was something of a standardization of identity in a way that didn't exist in the ancient world, where people were separated by distance and had a hard time sort of passing ideas fluidly between communities, and so that's creating sort of a tightly shared set of consciousness about an identity or a culture, whereas Grimm's fairy tales were able to take off and become sort of a universally recognized part of sort of German cultural experience only after the printing press arrived. And mass media has further accelerated that ability of culture sort of homogenizing now today. And so when we talk about ancient hatreds and pointing to some sort of ancient past, right, which of the many varied ancient Serb or Croat cultures are you pointing to as the kernel of today's Serb communities or Croat communities? And so again, for a variety of reasons, social scientists are very skeptical of this idea of primordialism, but I wanted to tackle it head on and note that it has some real limitations, both in terms of describing the world and in terms of being a useful framework for analyzing why conflict breaks out. And hopefully some of the other theories that we tackle will do a better job of trying to understand why conflict breaks out and trying to understand where identity comes from and how it shapes and operates in politics.